Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Arab Center, Washington, D.C. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Center. I'd like to welcome you today to this conversation, essentially focusing on political turmoil in the Sudan, which has been the subject of media attention globally, including, of course, here in the United States, whose administration is concerned about developments there. As you all know, essentially on the morning of Monday, October 25th, the Sudanese military in charge of the government in Sudan declared a state of emergency in the country and dissolved the power sharing system or arrangement that exists in the country, including, of course, the dismissal of the civilian prime minister, detaining different activists and cracking down on demonstrations in opposition to this policy. Many questions have arisen over the past few days. Does this constitute a classic kind of military coup? Does this power grab has any impact on regional developments in neighboring countries, particularly those who are undergoing some chaotic developments themselves, like in Libya and Tunisia and so on? And is the situation in the Sudan retrievable? I mean, can we really, at one point, should wisdom prevail, kind of go back to the status quo ante before this coup? To help us answer and decipher a lot of these complicated questions, we have one of the best authorities on Sudan joining us today, and we will be spending about 25, 30 minutes discussing these questions and other questions to help understand the situation there in Sudan. I'm very honored to host today my good friend and colleague, Dr. Abdelwahab El-Affendi. He is the Provost and Acting President of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Doha, Qatar. Dr. ElAffendi was Dean between 2017 and 2020 of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at the Institute. Prior to that, he was the head of the Politics and International Relations Program at the Doha Institute. And he also founded and coordinated the Democracy and Islam program at the University of Westminster in London between 1998 and 2015 before he moved to the Doha Institute in Qatar. Dr. ElAffendi served as visiting fellow or professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway between 1995 and 2003. He also taught at different universities, including Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, Oxford, Cambridge, and the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Malaysia. He served in prior incarnations as a diplomat, was a member of the Sudanese Foreign Service between 90 and 97, and held various positions in journalism, mostly based in London, including editing several publications there between 1982 and 1990. Dr. ElAffendi holds a PhD in political science from Reading University in the UK, and a master's degree in philosophy, Swansea University of Wales, also in the United Kingdom, and a bachelor degree in philosophy from University of Khartoum in the Sudan. Dr. ElAffendi has written many articles and several actually books extensively, both in Arabic and in English, covering mostly the field of critical theories of democracy and democratic transformation, contemporary Islamic thought and modern Islamic movements, politics and society in the Arab world, and other related topics. Dr. Abdelwahab, welcome to Arab Center, Washington, and thank you for taking time out to be with us to discuss this very important subject.
Thank you very much, Khalil.
Let me begin.
A small correction. I think I was the Michelson Institute twice in 1995 and 2003, so not a whole period.
Excellent. Sorry for that. At any rate, as I said in my introductory remarks, on Monday morning, October 25th, the Sudanese military declared the state of emergency in the Sudan and did dissolve the power sharing sovereignty council and the transitional government that existed in the Sudan for a while, and did detain the Prime Minister, Abdalla Hamdok, and suspended key parts, if not all, of the transitional constitution that was under discussion. Were you personally surprised by the news on the morning of October 25th, and why?
I think no one was surprised because it was obvious that this was moving in that direction. I was rather surprised that the American envoy, Mr. Feltman, was actually in Khartoum on the evening before, on the eve of the coup, talking to Al-Bashir Hamdok. And he didn't notice that everybody, the military have been threatening, and they have been, the civilians also were angry at them, were heaping abuse. So there was a clear split within the two sides of the coalition who were running the transition, and each side was threatening the other. So a lot of people actually were just waiting for it, because at that time it appeared that the relationship between the two sides had reached a point of no return. So I'm surprised that the people were not surprised.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Before we delve a bit deeper into the causes, if you will, of what happened, technically speaking, I mean, people, including governments, are having a hard time describing, if you will, or characterizing what took place. Are these steps that were taken in Sudan, are they a classical military coup d'etat from your perspective?
Well, I think it's a coup d'etat in the sense that, as I said on my Facebook page, if a military officer comes on TV and announced the dissolution of the existing authority without any reference from any legal authority, that's a coup. But it looks more like, it's not a classical coup in the sense that it looks like what Qais Said did in Tunisia, in the sense that the person was already the president, the person was already in charge of the military, so he just said to the civilians, well, I don't want you here. And the same that Qais Said, for example, said to parliament and everybody else, and he has the military on his side, I don't want you here. But that, of course, is a change of the regime. It's not, there's no change of president, but there's a change of a regime. That it's no longer what it was, because it was a partnership. Now, some of the partners are in jail, and some of the partners are running the show alone. So it is not a classical coup, but it's a coup. Maybe also similar to what Jamal Abdel Nasser did, for example, against Najib. Both of them were running the country together, and one side said to the other, well, you're not welcome anymore.
These steps that were taken in the Sudan, you kind of described some of the similarities with what took place in Tunisia over the past few months. When you look at what Abdel Fattah al-Burhan did, how did he justify? I mean, can you summarize for our audience the rationale for doing so?
Yes. I think there were constant complaints, let's be frank about that, about the way Hamdok was running the country in several levels. The economy has been run down. Although the revolution against al-Bashir was for bread and dignity, there was not much bread provided by Hamdok. Things got much worse than they were in al-Bashir's time. And people are actually, the salaries are not enough, and there's no bread, and there's very little other supplies. Secondly, there was an important issue about the rule of law. There was a committee which was formed to dismantle the old regime, and it was acting without any legal architecture. They didn't have a constitutional court. They didn't have any way of, there's no means of appealing against their rule. And they appeared to be very corrupt. They were actually arresting people and blackmailing them to give them money and things like this. But worse still, there have been splits within the coalition, the civilian coalition. The civilian coalition was at first dominated by the left. Incidentally, the Iraqi faction of the Ba'ath Party, together with the Communist Party, were the main actors who got the lion's share of ministries. And later, the Communist Party split and said that this regime is not working and it's causing up too much with the. The general argument was that this regime is controlled by 4 parties. All of them are minority parties: the Communist, the Ba'athist, and one liberal party, 2 liberal parties, 1 faction from the Unionist Party. So the faction actually of the government itself and of the freedom and change forces, they started protesting and holding rallies and saying that they have to change this government and make it broader. Now, the military, of course, they are said to have encouraged this protest, so they used it again and said, try to force Prime Minister Hamdok to change the government. They asked him to dissolve the government and create a government which is broader based. And they said, we cannot have this country, the coalition run by only 4 minority parties. You have to be more inclusive. Hamdok agreed in principle, but he said he is not going to do it under threat, and asked the military to give him some time. The military, I think, thought that they had a momentum. There's already protests on the street. And also at the same time, some members of the civilian cabinet and the Sovereignty Council began to attack the military side, saying that they are a disgrace to us. We should have a relationship with them, and so on. So the military felt both threatened and also felt the opportunity, so they decided to go for a bow and grab, as you rightly said. And they did it. They thought at the time there is an atmosphere in the streets which was on their side. But as you know, not everybody was with them.
What you refer to as this institutional architecture in the country, in the Sudan, which also was the subject of your recent opinion piece in Al-Jazeera's website in English, an excellent explanation of what took place in Sudan. I mean, you just explained what this institutional architecture is, but did that architecture make the coup in a way inevitable because it wasn't a working structure?
Yes, I think it was, as I said, very anomalous in the sense that when al-Bashir actually did not fall from outside. He fallen by his own military. Actually, this was the so-called Security Committee, which was supposed to protect al-Bashir's regime. It's made up of a number of army officers and security officers and some politicians. And they decided at one point, when they saw that there's so many, the protests were going up and up, that they should get rid of al-Bashir to save the regime. So they get rid of al-Bashir and started negotiating with the civilians about a deal. They didn't reach a deal. So, and there was this sit-in which was outside the army headquarters. They decided to violently disperse the protesters. There was a massacre, quite a few hundred, a couple of hundred people were killed. And so then the whole process halted. But I think the civilians at that time felt that they did not have the same leverage they had at the beginning, that the military could very easily end the protests. So then the African Union and others intervened, and they managed to get a deal between the two sides. Now, the deal was anomalous, as I said, because the two sides have no agreement on much things, and the coalition, which was the transition government, which was put in place, was tasked mainly with finding who did the massacre and punish them, and everybody knew who did the massacre. It's the military and the militia of the so-called rapid support forces led by Hemeti, who is the deputy chair of the so-called Sovereignty Council. So there was this uneasy relationship. They are enemies in the same bed, and they have divergent agendas. And the civilians keep threatening the military that they will one day arrest them and bring them to account or hand them to the International Criminal Court and so on. And the rank and file and the supporters of the civilians sometimes, that's what the communists, for example, did, attack them for being too cozy with the military and say, you have sacrificed the blood of the martyrs, and so on and so on. And there have been a lot of abuse against them for this. So there was this uneasy relationship. And then there was, they made the so-called Juba Agreement, and the Juba Agreement brought in some militias from Darfur and other areas. They became part of the government. This new group were not happy with the way things were arranged in the past. At the same time, there were many tribal now and ethnic protests, like the Bija protest in Port Sudan, which blockaded the port. And it is very interesting that, for example, the civilians said to the military, you go and disperse that protest violently. And the military said, no, it's a political thing, you go and talk with them. It's not a military thing. And so it happens that the military are calling for peace and negotiation, and the civilians are calling for violence. But in any case, the military, this is the way the architecture is built. Secondly, as I said earlier, because the whole architecture of the transitional government was supposed to prepare for elections. Nothing has been done up to now to do any preparation for election. There is no commission, there is no law, and this, in this case, they kept prolonging the period. The period is usually in Sudan's past transition, the transitional period were maximum 1 year.
Relatively short, yeah, in the past.
When the government, and the task of the government was just to prepare for the election. They do not engage in politics. Now, this current transitional government has tried to restructure the political system. For example, they had a group of so-called liberal ministers, like the Minister of Religious Affairs and the Attorney General, and some other educationalists who want to water down the religious content of education, create new laws which angered a lot of people in Sudan, the traditional Sudan, for example, legalizing homosexuality and doing things like this. So there were issues which the transitional government want to engage in a lot of social engineering, religious reform, things like this, which being a minority group were not in a position. So this angered the traditional society. That's why the protests, for example, which took place before the coup, were mainly by traditional tribal leaders and groups from the roots countryside.
Yeah.
But so that there was
let
this
me ask you this, Dr. ElAffendi. I mean, you're talking about conflicting and contradictory agendas domestically. But it seems to me that there are also conflicting agendas with regards to external factors having an impact on what's taking place in Sudan. Could you address the external factors and the conflicting agendas here?
Yes, but let me just add a small thing.
Please.
One of the conflicting matters was the existence of this rapid support militia of Hemeti, which used to be called the Janjaweed, which have perpetrated atrocities in Darfur. But al-Bashir strengthened it and make it a kind of his right hand, because he was, in his last days, he was mistrustful of the army, and it appeared that he was right. It was the army who removed him. So the civilian component of the transition, they were also reliant on this militia, because they also didn't trust the army. So the militia actually expanded so much financially and in membership that it became even more influential than the army. And this is also one of the anomalies. Now you have a militia. Now the militia sided with the army now against the civilian. In the past, the civilians thought that it was their protection against the army. So going back to the external affairs, the coup, the transitional government was strongly supported by the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt for different reasons. Mainly because Hemeti and the militia were already under Burhan, were overseeing the war in Yemen. And they were supporting Saudi Arabia and the Emirates militarily. So they were close to the Emirates to a level that they wouldn't talk to Qatar at all, for example, at one point when they were boycotted. And they actually, when the Qatari foreign minister wanted to visit, or it was the defense minister, they refused to allow him in. So there was this total reliance on the UAE, Egypt, Saudi axis. And but the Saudis, I think, and the Emiratis, they did not like the civilians because they were mostly radical from the left, although they shared with them their hostilities, the Islamists, but they thought generally that you do not trust civilians, especially if it's going to lead to democracy, and they don't like democracy. So I think they have encouraged Al-Burhan to go for the coup and promised him, because I think on the eve of the coup, he went to Egypt. And I think he got blessing for it from there. and both the Egyptians and the Emiratis actually blessed none of them ever criticized the coup, and the media in both Egypt, Emirates, and Saudi were actually all the time supporting the coup.
In light of that, Dr. Abdelwahab, does it make sense to you the statement that was issued yesterday here in Washington by the State Department on behalf of what they called the Quad for Sudan? The Quad includes, of course, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the USA, and the UK. I mean, what's in common then between these four? If the US is really trying to put the lid on this conflict, yet it joins a Quad with those who are encouraging it.
I think, I think probably the Americans thought that if the two countries which were most supportive of the military came up and said, please give up. As you know, they also went to Israel because the military have made relations with Israel. So I think that's grabbing at straws in a sense, but also I think everybody and the military in Sudan themselves will know that this is not serious, because usually I suspect that in private phone calls, the Emiratis and the Saudi will say to them, don't bother about this, we just need to please the Americans, but we'll support you.
Is there a role for Israel in this conflict? It was leaked this morning that there was a phone conversation between our Secretary of State, Blinken, and Defense Minister Gantz in Israel, asking on behalf of the US if Israel could intervene with al-Burhan and have him, change his, if you will, coup. Does that make sense to you? Does Israel have that much influence in Sudan?
I think there was a report that Hemeti has went to Israel before the coup.
Yes.
And probably get blessing from the coup. I think the background to the relation with Israel, as you know, that President Trump, when he was in power, had pressurized the Sudanese government into, in particular the military, into having relations with Israel, and made that condition for delisting Sudan from the state-sponsored terrorism. And so I think the military, at that time, the civilians were completely outside the game. They didn't know anything about it. The Burhan himself went to Uganda and met with Netanyahu. And I think this has created a momentum whereby Sudan was forced to announce to go with the so-called Abraham deals, and just increase the number of so-called Arab states which are having relations with Israel, to create the impression that there is no, but they were coerced into this. And lo and behold, as soon as they did this, there were announcements from Washington that Sudan is no longer in the list. Of course, they paid also $300 million, which for starving Sudanese is a lot of money as compensation. And I can say, I think with a lot of certainty, that the accusation against Sudan in this terrorist act has no basis at all, because they happened after they followed the American dictates in throwing Osama bin Laden out of Sudan. Although I think at that time the Sudanese said to the Americans, it's better for you if he is in Sudan, because here we can control him. If he goes out, we are not to blame. They say, and they say, where should he go? And they said, we don't care. So I think if somebody is to be put on trial for this, is the American administration at that time of Mr. Clinton, who did engineer this deal. Was Clinton? Yeah, I think it was Mr. Clinton. But anyway, that's how things are. But so the relation. But I don't think the Israelis have that much influence on. I mean, is all, as I said, grabbing at straws, because going to the Emirates and the Saudis and now to the Israelis, being that the Americans are desperate and they haven't got. If America itself couldn't have the influence, how could the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis, who are subordinate to America, have more influence? That's a good question. But I think that there was a lot of suspicion that America has partly blessed this coup. Because if you have Mr. Feltman there on the eve of the coup, and he says, well, he didn't get the impression from Burhan that he will do a coup. Well, I mean, if a politician that had this difficulty in understanding things in front of his own eyes, that's some questions.
Yes, and it did create some confusion, at least on the part of the Sudanese counterparts. Frankly, I was on a program earlier this week with a spokesman for the military in Sudan participating, in which he countered my point that I was making on the program by saying, well, the US speaks from both sides of its mouth. What we hear from Feltman is one thing, and what you hear in Washington is a totally different thing. But let's conclude with the following question. In an interview, one of his most or latest interviews with Sputnik, General Al-Burhan said that he will be appointing what he called a non-partisan technocrat as Sudan's next prime minister. Are technocrats becoming the new fig leaf for authoritarian leaders in the Arab world? And would such an appointment really resolve the issue or the crisis?
Yes, I think this is also in the constitutional document of the transition, that there was agreement that there should be so-called kafa'at appointed to run the means non-partisan or party-neutral professionals. I think that's a problematic thing first, because ruling a country is not a technical thing; it's a political thing. Even if you are a technocrat, you will become a politician, because you have to make decisions about who to take money from to give it to the other. And for example, the former finance minister, who was both a partisan, he was a member of the Ummah party, but he is one of these, he's a friend of mine, one of these economists who have been in the World Bank and all these things. But he decided at one point to increase the salaries of the professionals, like university professors and medical doctors and all this class, by 500%. And I said to him and to other people, I'm not an economist, but this doesn't look like a wise move.
A workable arrangement.
And in fact, yes, it created both problems, in the sense that the government he said, I have got the money for it, and I can get it from there, and I have got my budget balanced. But in a month, in the next month, he was unable to pay this amount. And secondly, immediately, of course, an inflation occurred where this apparently huge sum of money became worthless in a few months. So talking about technocrats and professionals sometimes might be misleading. and one of the things also which I criticize is that Hamdok is, of course, also like the former finance minister, is one of the World Bank and these things. But when the government made an economic committee, they chose as chairman Mr. Hemeti, who I think he hasn't gone to grade, past the third grade. So you see Hamdok folding his arms, standing behind Hemeti, who is pontificating about the economy. and how to get out of the crisis. So there was a lot of, when I say it was an anomalous transition, I do mean it.
Let me
Yeah.
ask you, I know academics don't like yes or no question, but let's conclude with a yes or no question, if you don't mind. I'm sure you've seen probably the opinion piece in The Guardian on November 2nd by Nisreen Malik, the title of which was Sudan's coup has shattered the hopes of its 2019 revolution. Is the status quo ante in Sudan still retrievable or recoverable? Yes or no?
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate your candidness. Appreciate your generosity in spending this time with us. And thank you so much for helping us to try to understand a complex situation in the Sudan. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us, and a special thanks to Dr. Abdelwahab El-Affendi for spending the past 30 minutes with us trying to explain this complicated situation. Thank you. We hope to see you in a future program. Thanks, Dr. Abdelwahab.
Thank you very much.